Hey, thank you all very much. I really was encouraged to hear how many of you really just enjoyed the discussions, and you felt like you were getting quite a lot from them, especially in those conversations where there was a great degree of interchange. And we're going to continue to try and encourage that in our sessions and in our as we go along in our next 2 days or the next day and a half, and we've got left, continue these collaborative discussions. We are going to move on now to a fun panel, a good one to end the day on. I'd like to invite our panelists up for our Men's Attitudes panel. And as they come up, I'm going to take the liberty of introducing our moderator, James Abraham. So James Abraham is the managing director and CEO of SunBorne Energy, which develops solar power plants, and as such leads India's largest public-private partnership in solar R&D. So those of you who were in Ashok's breakout and you're interested in the government partnerships and you would like to learn more about them, you may want to engage with James after the panel. I did tell him I was going to harass him up here. I feel at liberty to do so. James is an old friend from my days at the Boston Consulting Group, where James was a senior partner, I was not, and he helped to open the India office some time ago. He specialized in infrastructure and social development projects at the time. And happily for James, I had retired from BCG before I moved to India, so he didn't have to make a decision as to whether or not to employ me, which may not have gone in my favor. Now, James, in our planning sessions for this panel, James professed that he was actually the perfect moderator for the Men's Attitudes panel, because as we were discussing some of the nuances of where attitudes come from, he said, you know, I'm actually quite perfect because I have no bias. I know nothing about this topic. And I beg to differ, because James is clearly male, that no one can argue with. And I can assure you that in my time knowing him, he has never been short on attitude. So I'm going to hand it over to James. I'm going to invite you to introduce your distinguished panel, and I thank you for the good conversation that we're about to have. We're going to hold the conversation in the same way as we did before, interactive, no speeches, so that you get the best content. We're going to follow that by table questions, and James is going to moderate the question and answer period. You will have the same opportunity to have your table conversations and provide questions to the panel. So if they're coming up during the panel conversation, just write them down. We'll collect them at the end of the interaction. Thanks.
Thank you. Are we on? Yeah. Laura. I wish I could have introduced Laura yet. Thank you very much, Laura. And thank you for inviting me to this panel. Let me introduce my fellow panelists, just so that I don't miss anything. So we have, to my right, we have Rema Nanda. Rema helped found and is a trustee of Jagriti Youth, which is an interesting platform for girls and boys in rural India, and specifically around Bihar, I understand, to learn civic leadership and to campaign with them to stop some of the harmful practices, including gender violence and child marriages. She's had, coming into Jagriti, she had over 20 years of experience with the United Nations agencies, national and international nonprofits. And it was interesting in our preparation for this, she talked a lot about the impact, the results of the work that was going on there. It was very, I mean, for me coming in, being a neophyte, it's quite interesting. So I'm looking forward to hearing about that. Then we have Dr. Dipankar Gupta. So Dr. Gupta is one of India's leading authorities in sociology and social anthropology, and with over 3 decades of work and experience behind him, has taught at some of the leading universities, JNU here at the University of Delhi, as well as in places such as Deusto University in Bilbao, Spain, and others. Today he's on the board of several companies, as well as the Doon School, a place like the RBI, National Bank of Rural Development. He's an author, a writer, with over 70 research papers and 17 books. And interesting, in our preparation, had mentioned that there was a lot of gender bias that shows up in his research, although his research is not directly related to gender bias. It does show up as a root explanatory vector, if we can call it that, for some of the outcomes. So looking forward to hearing about that. And then we have Rujuta. Did I say that right?
That's right.
Great. Rujuta Teredesai. So Rujuta has helped found the Equal Community Foundation. You've already heard from her earlier. And there, interestingly, the focus was very much on the need to engage boys and men across, and not just as a separate initiative, but within the initiative of initiatives that already exist across different platforms. And she's been working on that, and it'd be interesting to hear how that's been panning out. And then we have Ms. Neera Nundy, who's founder of Dasra, and I will hold back my usual introductions of Neera, being an old friend. And she's now, as you know, launching the social impact leadership with the Harvard Business School, and taking on 30 very successful social entrepreneurs. I've met many of the entrepreneurs that she works with, and they're quite inspirational. So it'd be great to see how they go through this program. She's also with Dasra, helped author and lead the work on some interesting research reports. The most recent ones, which you've seen here, Zero Traffic, Anti-Sex Trafficking, No Private Matter, Domestic Violence, and Marry Me Later. Very interesting titles. So I'm looking forward to hearing how that comes through. So the way we'll run this panel, as Laura had mentioned, is we'll have a quick conversation here. We're not going to have everybody talk through and give you a long explanation, but really help challenge each other in what we're finding, and then we'll open up to the tables to have a discussion at your tables, and then we'll do a Q&A to close it off. Okay? So I thought I'd start off by asking each of you an open-ended question, which is, I mean, the purpose of this panel is to explore the source of men's attitudes and where they come from, and how that leads to sexual bias and eventually to the extreme of violence. So, so open-ended question. What is, from the work that you've seen, the experience that you've had, what is the source of some of these biases? And within that context, how much of it is nature, that is our DNA, we're just supposed to be biased, or how much of it is nurture, that is the environment has created us this way? Anyone like to start? Rema, since you're sitting to my right.
Thank you. I think I'm going to stay away from the nature-nurture piece for now. But in the work that we do in rural India, there's a couple of things that I thought were particularly striking. The first one is that boys and girls, but boys primarily, as young as 8, have ideas about violence as being somewhat acceptable. That in many homes in the intervention villages where we are, in our mapping, what we discovered is that the boys would say things like, in Hindi, "Ek thappad laga diya to kya problem hai, koi problem nahi hai." Or that the parents, in the home there would be violence and the boys would get caught up in it, and the mothers and sisters or the women in the homes were kind of saying, it's okay, you know, you shouldn't get too upset about the violence because someday you're going to grow up and do similar things. So what came through to us is that the boys are in that moment not quite clear about what their own opinion is. They're young enough and open enough to say, we're not sure. We sort of think this is not okay, but we'd like to know more. So I think that there is a growing need clearly out there with young boys not clear about how they should be responding to it, and also wanting to talk about their own feelings. Some intuitive sense that this is perhaps not the best way to go about it, but then socially being in, you know, getting into a space that says, well, if we don't do it, we get teased. You know, older boys telling younger boys, being masculine means you have to do this. Eve teasing, you know, there's a whole continuum of things that happen between boys and girls from a young age on, where the boys are seen as perpetrators and the girls as victims, whereas in fact there's actually a lot of gray space in between.
You talked about this age between young and old boys, where the old boys are, it seems like their opinions are already entrenched, whereas the young ones are still forming. How do you define that age group?
What we try to do is group them together. So we have boys 8 through 12 in a group, and then 13 and above or 14 and above till about 19. So our age group is really 10 through 19, but sometimes we'll have boys as young as 8 come into the group, in which case we have to form, get them together separately.
Dr. Gupta?
Well, I don't think I can overlook the nature part of things, especially this thing is all about men's attitudes. I think men do have an attitude. So, well, let's take that on board. Yes, we've heard about testosterone zinging about, but the fact of the matter is that there is no society that I know of which is a matriarchal society. The idea of the Amazon is really a bit of a fiction. You have matrilineal but no matriarchy. So you have patriarchal, men-ruled societies almost everywhere. And that's something that is a given. But there are social institutions that exaggerate certain tendencies. And it is these social institutions that we must pay attention to if we want to overcome them. Let's go one by one, and I won't take too much time. In the Indian context, for example, you have the joint family, and in North India in particular, you have something called the Kanyadan. The Kanyadan complex, I think, has done the worst possible things to women's dignity in our country. Because in Kanyadan, the boys' side is always superior to the girls' side. And this will remain forever, and not only in this generation, but the next generation as well. In some parts of North India, the girl's father is supposed to worship the feet of the bridegroom-to-be. Now, in this kind of unequal relationship, of course, many marriages are found, but many relationships founder. And we don't take that seriously. In fact, if you look at the Dravidian system of kinship, and I'm exaggerating the case a bit, you'll find that because of cross-cousin marriage and uncle-niece marriage, the woman is not an alien person in a married home. And you find much lower degrees of violence in South India than in North India. And I think the Kanyadan complex is a very important aspect of this. I have toured all over the country, and when I first went to South India, I wasn't really expecting the kind of assertion or independence of women there. Whenever a woman would enter a space where men were in abundance, as to get, tense internally, as just a bit bottled up. And then I realized there's no need to get tense. Things are quite different here. So when you look at Kanyadan, there's one institution that exaggerates this tendency. Joint family too. Joint family is actually a gang of men, fathers, uncles, brothers, they get together. And in a joint family, a woman's role is really very, very insecure. Her position is very insecure. Then as time goes by, the daughter-in-law becomes a mother-in-law one day. And the daughter-in-law becomes a mother-in-law with a vengeance if she has given birth to sons. So in the past, she had come from a family that was downgraded by her husband's family for being a bride-giver family, and they were a bride-taker family. And now that she has sons of her own, she can be a bride-taker herself. And she is kind of neutered in that sense. She becomes sociologically a male. And when people often wonder, why is it the mother-in-law can do such terrible things to the daughter-in-law, and doesn't a woman empathize with other women? There's a problem there simply because of sociological intervention. That woman is now a wife-taker. As a wife-taker, she absorbs those attitudes. Now, which is why I think that while we accept that men and women are different, I'm not going to the extent of Freud saying that anatomy is destiny, but we are different, and that difference should be accepted. But that does not mean that we must be unequal. And it's this inequality that I think is very, very important that we must address. I have found, for example, that in societies where the law is very strict and very firm and doesn't allow for violence against women, you find patriarchy, taking a step back, many steps back, and kept in check. So I would say that if you want to change men's attitude, you're not going to do, you can of course make some headway in terms of educating them and stuff like that. But you need to do a few things. One is urbanization. With urbanization, the joint family takes a beating. And that gives women a certain leverage in the family, which is very important. Urbanization also makes a woman more independent, and she's also a job seeker. urbanization, I think, also brings down that aspect of Kanyadan, because one of the things in urbanization is a true metropolitan experience is when you can't, Salman Rushdie said the metropolitan experience is one when you can't choose your neighbor. I think a true metropolitan experience from the Indian point of view is one when you can't choose your son-in-law, or daughter-in-law. And when that happens, I think the joint family takes a beating, and the woman has more scope within her familial surroundings, which is very, very critical to tempering the institutions that we are saddled with in our country, in our society. At the end of the day, we must also realize that unless you have a strict adherence to the law, and the law enforcement officials are very, very strict about their work, and they make no allowances at all, unless that happens, you will never really be able to break the back of patriarchy. You will, make it difficult with joint families going down the tube, with urbanization coming up, but you must have the law on your side. If the law is not on your side, if it's not unequivocally on your side, then all kinds of things can happen. Which is why, while I accept the various things that we do in universities, where I've taught for 3 decades, in various NGOs, I also think that we should not take our eyes off the ball and force the law enforcement officials to do their job like they should. Thank you.
Thank you.
So through our work, we primarily work with 14 to 17-year-old boys. And why do men or boys behave this way is one of the things that we learned is they know it's wrong, but it's normal. It's accepted. Nobody is challenging them, and that's one of the things that comes up. And once you challenge them, often the conversation stops. Whereas the conversation needs to start there. When you're challenging, you also need to equip them with, okay, this is wrong. What is an alternative? What is an alternative pattern of behavior? And that's where there's hardly anybody speaking to them about that. Within the family, there is nobody who can talk to them. Their influence is probably the elder brother, who is discriminatory, who is possibly violent. Other influence is the father, who sometimes comes home drunk, beats the mother up. They can see their peers harassing the girls in the street. So these are the influences. So rather than having a constructive dialogue when you challenge them, okay, you're doing something wrong, but what do I do about it? So that's the question that really doesn't get addressed. And that's one of the lessons that we have learned is once you've addressed the problem, is start talking about what can you do as an individual in your personal life and you as a part of your community, as a part of your family.
Thank you. Neera?
Yeah, so I think I'll probably mix in a little bit of Dasra's perspective, but also I think it might be helpful to bring out a personal perspective that I'm a mother of 3 sons and the implications of that and the implications of being a father or a mother and a parent. But from Dasra's perspective, if you look at our domestic violence report or our child marriage report, we have seen very few nonprofits actually focus particularly on this type of programming, as in having clear and constructed and well-structured programs to address men's attitudes. They happen at a very small scale, but how do we take them to scale has been a challenge for us to actually look for NGOs that are poised at that point for scale where we can bring that kind of funding in. And so there is actually a need for more funding, more prioritization around this particular issue as we start to gain a better understanding and the research behind which, if you address boys' and men's attitudes, it ultimately will impact issues of violence on women and girls. And there is more and more evidence to say that. I think to your sort of nature versus nurture, it's a big Aspen discussion. So we fight about it a lot, I know. I think if we think about it in this context as nature just being the sex you're born with. So that's your male and your female. And there's a lot of research to say there's actually limited difference other than the reproductive biological aspects. So I actually believe some of the attitudes is very much a nurturing, and that sort of leads to the role of the parent and the role of the mother and the role of the father on boys. And I actually think to the extent that it's young boys. So if I think about the questions that my own kids ask me, like, how come only women are how come only girls are teachers? How come you're going to work and everybody else's mom is picking me up from school? So these subtle questions that they start to ask about roles that society has placed us as women and men in, you start to realize that if you can break these non-traditional roles, I think that is actually at the core of trying to change the attitudes across, wealth and status and those things. And if you look at research, the fathers who take responsibility at home, whose kids see them doing things at home, you will start to change the mindset, and I think you'll have these boys, well, at least I hope my boys, actually be helping at home. And that actually helps women work, which kind of brings me to, the nuclear family versus the joint family. I think if you have enlightened joint families, the support system that exists there is very helpful for women to kind of be out there, and then that sort of leads to some of the non-traditional roles out there. But I think what was shocking for me, actually, one piece of research that I read is 80% of men in India believe that it is not their duty to help at home. And there's a lot of studies, and there's some really scary numbers about men's views, particularly in India, compared to Mexico, compared to Brazil or Croatia. There was an interesting multi-country study done, and we're appalling on those figures. It's little things. So, for example, one of the countries, I believe, has Croatia or Mexico, allows you to be in the delivery room as a father, or you can bring a partner in. So there are things we can do as a society. So, how many of you men actually saw your kids be delivered? Apparently, being in the delivery room and seeing your wife and being there has a tremendous impact on equality, on how you see her role and your role. So I think just a lot more research around that and pushing some of the policies towards it would help.
I think most men would faint.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. There's a lot of lines of thought that I want to pick up. I want to pick up on one about coming back to the first question about where do these attitudes come from. And all of you have hinted that it comes as much from society as from the women in the family. Can you talk a little bit more about that? And is that, if we affect that, is that the biggest lever of change? Is that the one that perpetuates these attitudes one to the other?
I'll take that first if that's. One of the key things that we've been talking about in our work is we have to stop pointing fingers. And each one in this room, as it could be a parent, teacher, and media, the key influences that we have identified have a role to play in raising boys and men. And raising not just boys as a child, but what are the expectations I'm setting on my partner, possibly? Or what are the expectations the society has from a man? Are we expecting men to be all masculine, to be the breadwinner, the gender stereotypes? Are we laying that burden on men? And answer often is yes to that. So we need to raise men differently. It could be how you treat your sister, how you treat so as a mother-in-law, there are a lot of expectations from a young man of how he treats his wife that comes from his mother. So in different roles, each one of us has a role to play in raising men. And I think
if I can just comment on this piece about where do women fit in this equation? I think there's two important considerations here. The first, and this is not about finger pointing as much as trying to understand how we do tend to polarize the discussion, as I said earlier, that all males are perpetrators and all females are victims. And this is a gross generalization, but generally that's how it's understood. So when we do the workshops, for instance, the innovation in our model is that we enable, encourage actively to get the boys and girls to talk with each other face to face. And it is a huge challenge, but almost every workshop that we've run over the year and a half that Jagriti has been in existence has been sold out. If we've only had 80 seats, we've had literally 200 people wanting to get in. So, but when they speak with each other, then there is a greater, we recognize that there's a gray space in between. That in the families where the mother and the women in the family are saying things like, it's okay, it's not a big deal. The boys end up getting confused, and so do the girls. So I'm not sure, we're not sure yet about whether you work with the mothers or the fathers, Rather, I think in our work, what we're trying to do is to get young people to take the leadership. They want to. They're hungry for it. They want to change the situation. The boys will often say, we're not monsters, you know, we're not bad guys. We don't all run around eve teasing and beating up the girls, so don't treat us like that. And there are girls who actually will say, we're not goodies, you know, we're not dolls, we're not going to break, we can stand up. But in that moment, in that room, when the girls and boys are talking with each other, there's a new pathway that opens, right? Because all of a sudden, one of the things that has happened is that it's possible to have a conversation about who's doing something and who's not, and how do they wish to fix that? How do they come to that solution? And we would like them to then take that back out to their families. So we do see that from the workshops, the participants will take, the boys and girls will take those conversations back into their family, and then we loop back to find out what happened, right? And you see that in your work as well, even with the boys.
Yeah.
And then, so the dynamic in the family begins to change. So the lever of change here are the boys and girls themselves.
So you mentioned a statistic when we had met earlier about the age at which they decide to get married. That through this work you've seen that change?
Right. So in this was from a previous project, Prachar, which is on the net, and what that showed was, and that was done with very tight metrics, and what that showed was that with the training, with 3 days of training that was given to boys and girls ages 15 through 19, unmarried boys and girls, the 3 days of training focused on sexual reproductive health and human physiology and biology, and some training around decision making. What the data showed was that the boys were delaying their marriage up to 2.5 years and the girls by 1.5 years. And so that really, you know, and that was run over a long period of time. Prachar lasted almost 13 years. And there have been many other projects since then that have focused on adolescent health and that are showing similar kinds of data. So that gives us hope that in fact engaging with young people directly, giving them correct information, building their capability is a good investment. And the earlier you get to them, the better it is, because they're more receptive and they're more open. Then the shame factor is not that high. What we find, for instance, when we work with the older boys, is that the shame factor is much higher. They are both worried about how will they be perceived if they appear too sympathetic towards females, or will they be somehow more girly if they're seen as sort of being supportive of girls or speaking up on behalf of girls. And they're also afraid about, you know, what other repercussions might this have. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a gray space. You know, it's women's involvement in oppressive behaviors that ultimately actually disempower and affect girls is a more complex undertaking. Earlier we were talking about the role of women in sex trafficking, for instance, right? How do you explain that? And someone actually asked that question, which I thought was interesting, is how do women participate in actually procuring girls and moving that forward?
I would just like to, I mean, what Rema was saying, I would like to share an example that we had recently in one of the communities where we were working, where graduates were conducting a community event where they're talking about street sexual harassment. And this is a community event where about 50 to 60 community members were there. And when they started talking, a girl just came up in the front and just said, actually, one of the participants of your program has been harassing me on the street. And immediately our mentor's reaction, how can that happen? But at the same time, that boy was held accountable by everyone in the community. And now when he said, okay, I accept I did this, and he has actually changed because he got the peer support. There were community members who were keeping an eye. So the whole social responsibility and accountability is something that became suddenly the motivator for this boy to change his behavior. And I just thought it was share that.
Well, let me push on that, and I think another question that Rema had also mentioned about this want to change. And Rujuta, you mentioned that right at the beginning as well, that with the peer support, it feels like these attitudes are crumbling. It feels also like from what I'm hearing across the board, that these attitudes are perpetuated by tradition that's not, and they perpetuate because of ignorance and lack of opportunity. That is, a lack of opportunity to meet and discuss, and lack of opportunity to build peer support. And this is what's actually stopping. And so tradition, as Dr. Gupta was saying, tradition tends to continue and perpetuates. Am I simplifying it?
Yeah.
May I just add a wrinkle or two? I know there's a lot to be done in terms of activism, and I cede territory very readily to activists. My wife is an activist, and I better do it. But I also feel that there's something to be said for structural inhibitors. And unless you pay attention to the structural inhibitors, your activism may perhaps, not really achieve its full potential. One major structural inhibitor mentioned was joint family. But what I kept quiet about earlier, but I think I've been sussed out to say it, and that is this: the other structural inhibitor is actually marriage, the institution of marriage. The institution of marriage is a very peculiar institution, and as most people who arrange arranged marriages will tell you, that marriage works best where there's inequality between the partners. The moment there's equality, then marriage becomes brittle. So they'll point to the Western societies and say, in the West, for example, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I cook, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, you cook, on Sunday, we have pizza, That kind of marriage is very brittle and doesn't last long.
What?
Those marriages last long, just hold it, those marriages last long with this inequality. That's the way they look at it. That's the argument they give, that inequality builds lasting marriages. And look at our joint families and look at our arranged marriages, how wonderful they are. Divorce rates are very few, and things like that. But these are all, ways of papering over a serious contradiction. And the contradiction is the heart of marriage, which I think you alluded to earlier, that unless we're able to tackle that head on, and as I said to you earlier, the best way of tackling that is, of course, intervention, which is by social activists, but also the institution of the progress of urbanization. And the downside of that is this, that in the past we had what is known as class 4 employees, who were by and large inefficient. They took a lot of time, they were paid a salary, they had a house, they had pension, they had gratuity, and we said it's a waste of time and money on these fellows. So we got rid of them, and we brought in contract workers. Today you don't have class 4 employees really, you have more and more contract workers. Now what has happened is very interesting from a violence point of view, from the point of view of, shall we say, how women are becoming increasingly unsafe in cities. As long as this class 4 employee had a house and a job and a pension and a gratuity, he was looked up to by his family, those in the village and those with him, his children, his sons in particular. And if they did something wrong, then they had to answer to someone. And there was the father, there was the mother, there was the grandmother on occasions in the house, and the father and mother were working wherever, and they were paying for the child's education. Today, with contract labor, they cannot afford a house. They cannot afford a regular job. And because of that, the children are all over the place. They don't live with the family anymore. And because they don't live with the family, they live with a bunch of boys getting together, living together. Under those straitened circumstances, there's just no control. Michael McCorby and Eric Fromm wrote a book called The Social Character of a Mexican Village, and they contrasted two villages, both very, very poor. But one village, which was hacienda ruled, the landlord ruled, other was just a corporate village. Poor people in both. But in hacienda ruled villages, the children were wild and couldn't be kept under control because the children saw their parents being violated by the master. Whereas in corporate villages, though the parents were poor, the children were, we might say, properly socialized. So these are some of the structural factors we must take into account. We can't ignore them. If we were to build those into our activism, I think our activism would go much further. And I wish them all success.
Neera, you were going to jump in?
Yeah, I think that we should just be careful in making the assumption that, women are going to help other women and men are going to help men or men are going to help women. I think that we should also draw on the fact that who holds power? and who holds influence. And I think some of the power dynamic as that shifts with, you know, whether it's working or not or income or not, it's a little bit to the empowerment discussion we had earlier today. But I think if you can balance that power, which confuses roles, typically in a marriage, then I think we can address some of it. But that's the challenge, right, is who's holding that? And there is actually research to, you know, your question around, your discussion around work. One of the main stresses that men actually have, which is the societal pressure of, I got to bring the income, I have to earn because I have to protect you all, and it is my responsibility, and that's part of being masculine and part of being a man, that, you know, it is somewhat of our responsibility as women as well now to share in some of the burden of bringing the income as we become, you know, more and more empowered. And so some of the economic factors around it, I think, also play a role in the power dynamic in the family as well.
So you connect that to the, you talked about roles being one of the most critical things, same thing you're speaking about now. And some of the roles, as Dr. Gupta also mentioned, are handed down generation to generation. They're set in the way, right, the joint family is set another way. Some are a matter of economics, and some can be changed. One observation, if I look at, to pick up on Dr. Gupta's point about urbanization, people moving in and becoming wealthier, I see roles becoming more solidified, more traditional than they were in the past. So I'm not, can you talk a little bit more about roles, and is that, you know, how do we break through that idea of roles?
So,
I mean, I know there's a personal aspect to your story because
right,
you're,
right.
but
So I think there's a large responsibility for institutions to play, right? Whether it's institutions that help to create and break some of the barriers around the roles. So, you know, the woman doesn't have to stay at home, or the man doesn't have to stay at home. There's daycare centers. I mean, when I was trying to put the kids in daycare, everybody in the family's like, they're 14 months, you're going to put them in daycare in India, and it's the most normal thing to do elsewhere. So I think starting to have support systems that are either at companies, either in schools, or that the government provides you to be able to afford it. I think there are institutional mechanisms that we can start to build in to help break some of these barriers. And it kind of goes to what Dr. Dipankar was saying, was that, you know, there's a role for these institutions to play to be able to equalize it all. So it's not just the law, like he was saying, like it needs to protect you from a legal point of view is definitely one aspect, but the government needs to be able to start to equalize. So in companies, you know, if I'm coming back or he needs paternity leave, there's a lot of things that they can do to try to have a level playing field to allow us to then establish our own roles, whether male or female.
Rema, you want to come in?
I just wanted to go back to that question about, thank you, Neera, for that point about expecting women to help each other and men will help each other. And I think that's something that has to be looked at again carefully, because much of the work that has happened around empowering women is still based on this notion that women will help each other, and if only women could get together and they would take care of things. Whereas in fact now the dynamics have changed to the point where women often are the ones who will resist. You know, that we find it easier to work sometimes with the males rather than with the women, who will say, well, you know, but we want this has been part of our tradition. So sometimes I like to joke about the fact that in India, culture is an automatic pilot, right? We just keep doing it. And so when we stop and question it, it is threatening. You know, it is about power and power sharing, and I think we are learning to question our own assumptions right now, because in the communities we work in, sometimes the women are as much a problem or greater problem than the men are. You know, because they'll say, we don't want to send our daughters to this meeting. You know, you're going to put them in the same room together. What's going to happen in that room? What are you going to do with our girls in the room? So, but at the same time, there are others who will say, you know, it's okay. We know you, we know the trainers, and we're going to take this risk, and we'll let them come to the meeting. So I do think that point. The other quick point I wanted to make is go back to this issue of structural pieces. So we're looking at both capability and accountability. And so in the accountability piece, I do think that the legal piece is going to be super critical, because no matter what happens, at some point, in a population this size, and according to the census, we have 243 million young people between the ages of 10 and 19. That's a staggering number. So even a percentage of that, you know, if we take them as being disadvantaged, are seriously disadvantaged, because even if they're going to school, they don't have this information, they don't have the life skills, they're just on automatic pilot and they're repeating the same cycle. I'll give you a quick example. In many of our workshops, almost 100% of the participants, and we take up to about 40 at a time, in one workshop, almost 100% will say their expectation is to be married and have children. And so then we do this whole process around, you know, what is marriage about, and what are responsibilities, and are you ready to take this into this? They haven't thought it through. They just think that that's, you know, that's something that has to be done. That's it. So, you know, I'm trying to link this to the structural piece around laws. Why are laws, and, you know, why it's important at some point. It doesn't matter whether you actually believe or not, you know, that this is the right thing, this is what the law says. Because otherwise this discussion goes on ad nauseum, you know, people will say, oh, you know, there's no harm, we did this earlier, now we have to do this again, it's the poverty, it's the girl's safety, it's this, that and the other, and it just keeps going, and every generation that comes along, we are losing young people into this, because once they get married, that's it. It's very hard to back out of anything, to do anything meaningful then.
That's the tough part about marriage,
right?
Isn't it? What I wanted to also add to this aspect about intervention from above, which is state intervention, there should be this law enforcement, and I believe very strongly with Giuliani. People make fun of him today, but I think his advocacy of the broken window thesis, that don't let a small crime go by unnoticed and unpunished, because every small time offender grows up to be a rapist one day. I think he was on the button with that. But I also feel there are certain things which you could do in terms of democratic citizenship, and that is giving women equal inheritance right. Equal inheritance is very, very important. I mentioned to you earlier there are no matriarchies, but I did say there were matrilineals. And in matrilineal societies, even though the girl's brother rules the roost, because the property comes to the woman's side, a woman has much greater respect in the family. So wherever women have property rights and are assured of property rights and don't have to depend on their husbands always to get some kind of foothold in the family property, I think women would be much more secure, and men would also feel the need to respect their wives and sisters in a way that they don't today. And I feel that this intervention from above is very important. They have done something of this kind in terms of urban laws, urban land, urban property, but not enough yet in terms of agricultural property, where much of India lives.
I would just like to point or add something over there is, I think a lot of these interventions need to happen simultaneously. Law enforcement, for example, like from whatever little I know about it, there are laws, but they're not being enforced. So enforcement becomes a challenge. But at the same time, for example, when our mentors conduct a session at 7 p.m. and we're asking, it goes back to gender roles as well. So men are attending these sessions and we ask, what is your sister doing right now? It's either cooking or looking after a sibling. And all we have to do is, why? Can you just exchange or rotate duties and responsibilities in their household? That's simple conversation. So working with boys, young men, there's work that can happen again with the current abusers or perpetrators. So all of these need to happen simultaneously, and some sort of collaboration or dialogue needs to be there around it.
What's the reaction you get when you suggest that? Is it time, it's time to switch roles?
I think often with this, especially with this age group, is like, oh, we haven't thought about that. But that would mean that we have to give up a playtime or whatever. And I say, yeah, it can be done only 3 days a week, and 3 days a week your sister can do this.
And have pizza on Sunday.
Yeah.
But you see, the point that she makes, may I just make a quick intervention? We need to think about what she said, and we need probably to widen the canvas. We should also look at Western societies and how they changed. We sort of take it for granted that they were already there, but they too moved, and they moved rather rapidly in the last 30 or 40 years. And to get a quick indexical version of it, think of 2 TV series. One is I Love Lucy, you know, and the modern ones today. In I Love Lucy, the woman is a bit of a, bumbler. And all the current TV sitcoms, the man is a bungler. The woman is smarter. Now, how did this change happen? What were the social forces that brought about this change? If you have I Love Lucy today, nobody will watch it. They'll think it's mushy, you know? So we need to pay attention to the Western societies as well and how they transformed over time. And maybe therein lies a secret. And the funny part is that people from the West don't tell you their secret.
They don't, sorry?
They don't reveal their secret. They ask us about our problems. I think we should ask them about theirs.
We have a few more minutes left in this. There's a couple of areas that have been raised that I wanted to cover, but I did want to pick up on one stream, which is how does the sexual bias move into violence? How does this bias of attitudes move to violence? When does it become that extreme? And I think it was when we had met earlier, we had this discussion that there's a moment at which men objectify the woman, and she's no longer seen as human, and that allows the shift from, you know, a bias to violence. I throw that up as a point, but how does that shift happen? Why do we move from bias to violence? Where does the attitude shift?
I don't know what you're talking about, because men have been violent throughout history. Men have been violent in hunter-gatherer societies, in feudal societies, in capitalist societies. The only time men are told to hold it and behave themselves is when there's a law that makes them do it. Men are like that only by nature.
Human nature.
And something else has to be done to make them behave properly. Nothing has happened in recent times, by the way, that men have suddenly turned violent. They always were. There's so many field researchers of tribal societies, hunter-gatherer societies, where men are violent round the clock.
To each other and to women.
And to women, and to women, and to women. In fact, they don't even let the women look at their hunting gear. The hunting gear is masculine property. If a woman looks at hunting gear, a few whacks. You see? So we don't see this whole thing as a modern development. In fact, in modern society, I see great hope that because of law, because of the breakdown of the family, because of the questioning of marriage itself, that we are raising this issue and sitting here and debating over it.
But you had mentioned in the, when you had opened about the roles that are taken up, picking up on Neera's point as well, the roles that are handed down generation to generation, and the role, position with which a bride enters a family, and that itself, you know, boxes her and limits her. And that allows, is that what's allowing men to say, then, okay, then this is my property, as it were. You know, I like my car, I also have a wife, and I can treat the car or the wife, or maybe I treat the car better, but.
So I think some of it is societal, right, and some of it is learned. So, you know, there's tons of evidence to say that a child who sees abuse and domestic violence in their home will either be a perpetrator or allow it to happen. So I think there's definitely the piece of what you see, you start to, that's your frame of the world, and therefore that gets repeated. But James, it doesn't mean like one day all of a sudden they he whacks her. It's these little, they start to do little things because there's the legal aspect that's protecting you a little. So they'll say things, then they'll push it again. You know, our research says they're beaten at least 35 times before she's able to get out of a domestic violence situation. And so there starts to be a pattern that continues to happen, at least with violence in the home. It's probably different, you know, outside these one times. And so I think it's learned. I think it continues and it becomes a power dynamic again. It brings me back to, so if he can get away with it the first time, he does it the second time, and then the third time, and then the fourth time. Which is why you need intervention from outside to support her to get her out of it. And I think we have to be careful to massively generalize to say, well, if you're in that situation, you're always going to be that. There are always these stories of incredible courage that just inspire others to get out of these situations, or inspires even boys and men who have been in those circumstances to come out and be, you know, the voices for change. So I think understanding what is it that switches these people who might have come from similar circumstances is something we could probably do a better job of.
So on this point about at what point do they really form these ideas, right? Which is what I find really interesting in the work with young boys and girls, 8 through 12, in a room together, in rural India, in a village. I want you to picture this and visualize this, because this is really happening even as we speak, as you know, they're in a meeting together for the first time in their lives. And you know, we go into this really nervous because we don't know how they're going to interact with each other, but they do, and they actually manage to talk to each other. And the boys say to the girls, and I want to really bring up the issue of Eve teasing, which is actually sexual harassment, but and how insidious and rampant it is. So in Bihar, what happens is that all these stories that we read in the newspapers about the girls not being able to go to school, not being able to get out of the home, are actually all true. It depends on which part of the state you're in and which village you're in, that's for sure. But it is there, and we've seen it, and we see it even now in our work. So what happens is when we get them to start talking about it, and the girls start to talk about how they feel when they get teased, and the boys start to talk about, well, you know, we're just having fun. And inevitably, one of the things that comes up is that the boys will say, well, if you hate it so much, why don't you say something? Why don't you all speak up? And the girls say, well, because if we speak up, you're going to beat us up, or somebody else will beat us up. So it's like a push and pull factor in there. Is the boys often will say, we didn't realize. You know, by the end of that second and third day of conversation, the boys are then starting to be more vulnerable and open, and they say things like, we didn't realize, we were just making comments. Our bhaiya ne comment mara, to humne bhi comment maar diya, isme problem kya hai? Right? So it's just simple things, it begins with that. Then we go through and talk to the older boys, and we see a similar pattern, except now the voice, the tone is much more defensive, and it's like, why are we making such a big deal out of it? It's no harm. And anyway, we didn't hit her, you know, we're not stopping them, they go to school anyway, what's the big deal? Much more hostile. So in circling back, I think it's a continuum of development, right? Adolescent, in this country, we really don't pay much attention to adolescent development, and those are really precarious years. You've got hormonal changes going on, you've got external pressures on you. The gentleman with the camera is nodding his head. I don't know if he's nodding at me, but anyway. But those are precarious years, and if you go out into these communities, no one is really paying attention to them.
Yeah.
Right? There's no school counselor, there's no, you know, the parents themselves are often illiterate. Their children are now going to school, but they're learning from textbooks, whatever, and so they're all just talking to each other, and it's just feeding off of each other. So to break that cycle, we have to intervene, right? And it is ultimately about saying we have to equalize this. So without saying one is all this group over here is perpetrators and all this group over here is victims. That's not true.
You know, this is a good launch point into our discussions for the round tables. So you'll have about 20 minutes at your tables. You also have, I think, cards there for questions you can write. You can address it to an individual panel or to the whole panel. Just to warn you, in terms of the power dynamic here, as moderator, I have the luxury, the responsibility, or the right, call it that. I will go through all of the comments and group them and ask one or all the panelists to then to respond to it. What we would like you to discuss at your table is about action. You've heard a little bit of a discussion about where some of the sources or the roots are of the attitudes that men have, and a hint at some of the changes that could come about. So the question is, sitting where you are in your organizations, in your families, in your positions, whatever that is, what are the interventions? Right? What are the actions that can lead to changes, that can lead to a slow change in attitudes that develop in men over time? Okay? And then, of course, raise questions and comments to us. And at 4:15, we'll gather those and we'll have a Q&A session for half an hour. We can have coffee.
Yeah, that'd be good. Sounds like
Can we leave? You done? Still?
yeah, we can.
Why do we stay?
Can we go out? Can we go out? I want to get out from this strobe light on.
4:15. What are they doing now? Oh.
Generating questions.
Great, thank you. Let's come back together for, I've gotten quite an interesting range of questions. Clearly the questions you're asking are far more deep than the ones I was set at, so thank you.
Uh-oh.
We should have started this a little bit earlier. All right, so the first round of, there's a set of discussions and questions about the different socioeconomic classes. This links to two aspects, and any of the panel members can jump in. One was around the fact that a lot of the discussions we've had were around the rural groups, socioeconomic class that is lower on the economic development spectrum versus the urban centers, the middle class, the upper middle class, where there may be as much bias or as much violence. And also linked to this, the idea of urbanization, as Professor Gupta has mentioned, that does that actually, with urbanization and with improved economic potential for people, if those two are correlated, does that decrease bias and decrease the violence against women, whereas we've seen lots of reports of cities being very unsafe. So that's the contradiction that I wanted to put forward. One, is there, does economic development actually reduce the biases? And if not, then should we have intervention programs as much for the socioeconomic groups that are better, more advantaged than others? And then if it doesn't, then how does urbanization and others, what role do they play in this? So broad set of questions.
Can I jump in?
Jump in.
So,
Thank you.
I mean, whoever wrote this, I think
Many people wrote this.
I would say it cuts across absolutely everything, and just from my, which is quite abysmal, because if it wasn't so cross-cutting, it would potentially be easier to target and solve. I worked at Morgan Stanley, an investment bank in Wall Street, perpetuated incredible amounts of gender bias. I went to Harvard Business School, which often is structured in a way that doesn't actually help women. Majority of our grades are participation. Putting your hand up and speaking out is not something that comes naturally to women. So there are structural biases and all kinds of things in extremely privileged companies, institutions. So this runs actually quite deep, which should be, concerning for all of us. And I was saying when we were sitting here, we need programs. There's some NGOs which have excellent programs for, disadvantaged communities, that if we could actually use those programs for the more privileged communities, we'd probably see a tremendous impact. So I'd say it runs deep.
I completely agree with you, and just wanted to add a challenge that we have faced. So we work with low-income communities and absolutely agree and know the fact that the problem exists across all sections of the society. But in terms of access, somehow the low-income communities are slightly or easy access or an entry point to start the conversation. If I was to have a similar workshop that we have in the communities within the middle class or the higher income groups or whatever, we wouldn't get that traction. And that's a challenge that we are trying to understand as well. So over there, what we're trying to do is, can we adapt the content that we are developing to go and speak to corporate employees, to go and go into private schools, and try and get the education board maybe to come on board with us on this. But that's a challenge that even we are trying to understand. What is the entry point?
Well, economic development is important, but it's not everything. If you're talking in terms of money alone, what economic development also brings about is, different sets of institutions, which allow for men and women to grow independently. It also means job security, and I think that is a very important factor, which we don't often pay enough attention to. When we talk about access to the poorer families, I think, what Rujuta says is correct, because when you go to do field work, it's much easier to do field work with poor people than with people of your background, because they don't talk to you, and there is a power equation there, because you ask them questions and they answer. So occasionally when I'm abroad, for example, many people ask me questions about my family and my religious background or whatever, and before I answer that question, I ask them about their family and religious background, and they are reluctant to answer. So when it's a power equation as well, so in terms of corporate sector and those who are same level, I think it is very important to insist upon the law. The Vishaka judgment.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The Vishaka judgment has now made absolutely clear that you can't pass off, sexual innuendos as tomfoolery, and boys will be boys kind of stuff, you know. There is the heavy hand of the law, and that has to be put in place. And unless that happens, it won't work. You know, have you ever asked yourself that while rapes do occur in different countries all over the world, why is it that some countries like India, South Africa, there are so many gang rapes? Gang rapes don't happen with equal frequency in many other countries. And I think that is simply because in societies where the law is lax, you have a greater incidence of gang rapes, where boys get together and they think they're having fun.
Rema, did you want to know?
Just on this point about why we work with certain groups, and I think that's a choice that we make. We're a non-profit. We choose to do this work, and our focus going into this community was not necessarily about addressing gender violence. My vision for Jagriti has very much been an outcome of 20 years of working in very large institutions and, you know, high level and lots of budgets and lots of big budget interventions, and discovering that at the end of the day, if the human being at the center of this effort has not changed, has not been touched in any meaningful way, then have we really succeeded? And so I was coming to this more from the idea also that we needed to have an India where there would be simultaneous interventions going on. There are many people who, after the Nirbhaya case, Jyoti Singh Pandey's case, essentially said, you know, this is where we're going to work, this is what we're going to do, and this is how it's going to be. And I didn't think that we had that was the space for us. For us, the space was very much in Bihar, because I had already spent so much time there and had all these connections with young people, and I see a multitude of young people in Bihar with potential who are not necessarily problems to be fixed, but also, you know, we need to capacitate them and get them up to speed. That being said, I do agree with everyone that, and I've also lived and worked in many countries. Let me tell you that gender violence is a continuum. It can be something as subtle as being asked to do something that you don't wish to do. And it's a professional piece of work that would need to get done, but it's the manner in which it is asked and the consequences of not doing that, which is harassment and all the rest of it, to outright proposition, to anything in between, right? So we need to understand that the constructs of gender violence are all pervasive, and sometimes it's both men and women in it. I've sat on diversity committees in the United States where women on the committee objected to certain policies that their offices wanted to put together. I've sat in offices in London, in Geneva, similar things. So it's hard to predict how people will actually react, but at the end of the day, you know, we make choices about where we can put our effort and make a difference. I imagine that there are already, and I'm looking at Radhika. No, I'm sorry, Lalita. I'm so sorry, Lalita, who works at Goldman Sachs, and she was just telling me how many policies they already have, and they're already on the ball. They've got things in place and they're moving. And I said to her, you know, how many Indian companies have adopted these laws? And she didn't think it was that pervasive. And we've heard from Chanda as well, right? So if we look at this as a continuum, from village to boardroom and everything else in between, gender violence is very, very pervasive. And it can come to us in many different forms, even in the way we say our prayers, right? We pray to goddesses, and yet we treat our women so badly. I've always wondered about that. Why is that, right? Our most powerful goddesses, gods are goddesses, right? And all the rituals around it. There are even goddesses where only men can go at a certain time to worship and women are not allowed. Think about that. So I do think it's very, very pervasive, but I also think that it requires multiple strategies and multiple interventions, and we shouldn't have to put, you know, the onus on one or the other. I mean, I think we should all take action from where we are. Most of us at some point in our lives perhaps would be parents. You know, what do we do as parents? So I do think that's
a couple of the questions you've raised are here again. Before we jump into that, I want to come back to this question about gang violence because that's also a question that's come up. And the question was about the Indian demographic, given that we have a demographic that is shifting towards more men than women. We're going to have more gangs of boys, gangs of men, right? And is this going to lead to an increase in this? Or is this going to lead to a situation where we'll have a stronger, more powerful economic lever that women have, because their supply demand, theoretically, should give them more economic power? Where do we sit on?
I think you're being very simplistic. It's not about demography. Demography plays a role in a number of ways, but this is not demography. When you have similar things happening in Africa, they call it jack rolling, by the way. You know?
They call it?
Jack rolling, gang rapes. Jack rolling. You know, it connotes fun, excitement. So gang rape is not about the demographic problem. There could be some connection with the fact that they both have a common cause. You know, that is, we have laxity of observance of law, which is why we have a gender mismatch, imbalance, and also because the same thing we have gang rapes, but the two are not directly connected. In many parts of India, Tamil Nadu being a very good example, the gender ratio between men and women is almost perfect. Whereas you come to North India, and even in well-to-do areas, you know, it's quite skewed. Even in well-to-do areas, is that just to me?
No, I was just
No, okay.
saying.
So that's one thing. The other thing is that I agree with what has been said just now. I think there's a great future in our young people. When I look at, yes, young people also do dreadful things, but I think the young have also shown us the way. In fact, the anti-rape agitation, I was so impressed to see such a large number of young men there. This is anecdotal, and take it for whatever it is worth. I recently saw a film called The Queen, I think it's Queen. It's about a young woman who's finding her way. And whenever she does something and stands up for her rights, I was so impressed, so overwhelmed and overjoyed that all the young men in the audience stood up and clapped. Now, this would never have happened a decade back. I think young men are changing, must be because of you.
That takes us out of the running. So let's talk about the change, picking up on this point. Do you think we're ready to break stereotypes? Are we ready to broaden choices, to remain unmarried, to be very happy with just a daughter? It's the way it was phrased. And how do we see people ready to break some of these stereotypes, creating safe spaces for women? We've seen some of that in the infrastructure in Delhi and others. Are they real, or do they work? And how does that come about? And how do we create the political capital? Are we ready to create a political capital or social capital that's ready for zero tolerance to gender violence? Are we at that turning point?
I think I just want to make a comment at that, actually. Are we ready to break gender stereotypes? I think we're definitely going to get a lot of conflict over it, so we better understand how to manage it. So that's where I think I don't think we have an option. It is going to start shaking things up. Women are getting more empowered, so they're going to ask more questions. It might cause more friction. So we need to equip men of how to deal with that. And we have to do it.
I agree. I mean, Hello? Yeah. I don't actually think it's about being ready. I mean, you don't wake up one morning and say, I'm going to have a baby, or wake up one morning and all of a sudden decide you're going to get married. It's similar. I think we are all responsible for pushing it. And don't forget, this is not like a historic moment in time. I mean, if you think about the feminist movement, I think a lot of my generation actually takes a lot of where we are for granted. There was a whole movement behind that I can stand here today, or that I was privileged enough to have what I had, has so much to do with what people built and struggled for before. So I don't think it's a question of being ready. I think it's a question that the discourse is changing, and that the movement's potentially becoming more inclusive, and that all of us are now able to take a bit more of that responsibility. And so I feel like if we push forward more, we will have to make the political situation more accountable. And so I feel that as our voices stand out, as we have platforms like this to have discussion, as we take risks for action, as we have sort of more movement towards it, I think we'll solve the next hurdle, and then there'll be another hurdle as we just continue to evolve.
connecting to the next question, if we feel that, you know, as Dr. Gupta had mentioned, the cheering at the end of the movie Queen is an indicator of attitudes changing. Are our attitudes changing ahead of our institutions? So we've also had a lot of discussion that institutions need to change. There's a question here about, you know, for strong action now we need institutions, we need government here, having the same debate saying what needs to shift to be able to make this thing happen. Is all that behind the attitudes of the population?
May I just say something very quickly? Ideas must change before institutions do. Ideas make the difference. You think of anything, anti-untouchability movement, for example. There was no institution. Gandhi said, I'm not going to stand for it. He didn't go about with the paper and pen asking people, do you like untouchability or not? You know? Likewise, when you have the law against polygamy. Ideas make a difference, but ideas have to make a difference and they go to the people and bring them up to that level. That is where leadership, you know, plays its most significant role. You cannot have any of these things without leadership. And I think a large number of people who have not been acknowledged wholesomely, but have nevertheless played very important leadership roles so that we are today where we are.
Just on this point about, you know, are we ready to change? Because change is already happening, but just to reinforce this idea again, I'm passionately advocating for investing in young people, simply because I see that as a missing link. When I look back on the work that we did to empower women, we just so focused on that, and we should continue to do that. And I want to be really clear that, you know, women are so disadvantaged, females are so disadvantaged that there is a need to invest in them to bring them up to speed. But simultaneously, if we really want gender equality and gender equity, we have to work with boys and engage them as well. But on this notion that, you know, government, everyone has said government has to do this and government has to do that, and government says they're doing it. I work a lot with ministries and they'll say we're doing it, and we have fantastic policies on paper. Everybody would agree to this, right? We have great laws. If anyone has taken the time, please read some of the laws. The child protection laws, for instance, are really detailed. The Anti-Prohibition, the Child Marriage Act, detailed. There are even structural policy notes that have been sent out to the districts, down to the village level, down to the block level. Where we fall down in this country is on that last mile. It's in the implementation. Things fall apart. We don't have time to get into why, but it falls apart. So in the meantime, you know, when we go out, that's why I said, I think the challenge here is what can we do from where we are? For us, our work is, this is what we do. So instead of waiting till the government comes, and I would go into the villages and I would do these sessions with the community, and they would say, you know, high child mortality, high maternal mortality, any number of problems. इसको आप लोग कुछ क्यों नहीं करते? और ये तो हमारा काम नहीं है, ये तो सरकार का काम है, ये पंचायत का काम है, फलाना का काम है, फलाना का काम है। ऐसे ठीक है, बैठे रहेंगे फिर, कोई नहीं आने वाला, कोई आया आपके यहाँ गांव में आया नहीं आया. So then we go backwards. When was the last time official came? You know, they're all scratching their heads and they're sitting there thinking, please hurry up. Then they remember 3 साल पहले कोई आया था, अच्छा ठीक है. You know, they're clueless. They really think government is going to come, give them a job, give them roti, kapda, makan. Not going to happen. So instead we say to them, you know, you take leadership. Take the lead. We'll help you. We'll give you the skills. We'll give you the knowledge. And you'd be amazed. I am so humbled. Bihar, UP, Andhra Pradesh, whichever area I have gone into, and I'm not trying to sell you on anything. All I'm saying is, truly there are young people who are willing to stand up and take the lead, whether it's fixing the drain, getting the school opened, talking to the panchayat about getting, you know, panchayats get 1 crore. I believe now that allocation has gone up. Where's the accountability for that money? Do we have time to go there and take care of this? No. So, you know, you empower those people, young people, and they go in there and they sort it out. It takes them time, but they sort it out. So I think that's already in process.
That's great. So wonderful pause.
Can I just add one little? I just want to add one little thing that maybe we are ready, and I think that, you know, it hasn't actually come up in a lot of our discussions, but just around reproductive rights, the fact that I can control my fertility, I think is something that we don't talk about enough. And, you know, it's, you know, I think there was a question about burden of having kids, but I think just being able to plan and have choice is so significantly liberating that is what just has changed the ability for women to just play equally on the role front. So I think, you know, pharmaceuticals, fertility things, stuff around reproductive rights, I think are really empowering. Sorry, I cut you off.
In one of the points all of you made is about that we need intervention. One quick question, and then we'll get into the next chapter before we close, is the length of time. How long does it take and before you start to see results, and how do you measure results? I'm sure you have a simple answer to this.
I've answered this question far too many times. I'll just start off. It's behavior change. So it's gradual. So we have a lot of conversations especially with funders, and say, okay, we want to see so do men really change? How do they change? When do they change? And there is no fixed formula. So what we are saying is we will provide certain number of sessions to expose them to these topics. When that journey of change is different from man to another man. And we need to understand that. There are ways that we need to monitor the steps, but it's behavior change. It's going to take time. And we need to be patient and provide inputs throughout.
I just want to do a fun thing. This is audience participation. Can you all please think about one thing that you have been trying to change? Just take a minute and think about one thing, whether it's giving up sugar or pick one. Not blow drying your hair, I don't know. Eating less fruit, eating more fruit, eating more veggie, eating less meat. Just think of one thing that you've been trying to change. And then take a minute. It has to be something significant, right? And then take a minute and think about how long it's taken you to get there. And how many of us still haven't gotten there. Please take some time, right? So when I get asked after 20 years of being in this, when I get this question, I can feel my shoulder tightening up because we want them to change like this, right? 3 session ke baad badlo, measure karo, kiya, nahi kiya, have you done this, have you done that? Well, hell, you know, it takes a long time. So thank you for saying behavior change. I don't even talk about behavior change anymore. What I want to see is fix your attitude, fix your attitude. This is okay, this is not okay. And if you do this not okay piece, bad things are going to happen. And they themselves, the young people themselves have now figured it out. And they said to us, the young people said to me at one point, I got a request that said, we want a couple thousand rupees. And I said, why? They said, ye Kanun, the Child Marriage Prohibition Act, they had reduced it, pulled out the key pieces, put it in Hindi, and they were going to plaster it everywhere. So wherever the villages are, they plastered it. And I said, why? They said, madam, India mein sab darte hain kanun se. Sab likha hai na, jail bhej denge. Now some of those young people on their own, we have never encouraged them to do this. They go into their families and they say things, watch out, शादी कर देंगे तो आपको उठा के ले जाएंगे, 2 साल की कैद, 2 साल ही हो जाएगा. So what I'm saying is, to that question about how do we measure, that's a long process, but in the short term, the way we measure in Jagriti Youth is that they get to decide what they want to measure. We honor their indicators and we go with that for now. Then we see how it goes, right?
I just add to that, I think that is a very important point because there are 2 sides that we are trying to measure. One is what do boys think, or what do these young men think? What are the milestones that they have set for themselves? That is really important to understand and acknowledge. At the same time, one of the things that we are doing is to interview the women in their lives. And that has been a really interesting piece, not just to get us data, but also to have that conversation with the mother, with the sister in the family of how this boy is behaving. And then we are automatically also starting to create awareness amongst the women in the family.
That's great. So as we come to the end, one last question area, and then I'll quickly summarize, which is around homes. So many questions about a lot of the gender bias that we see in society is because we're not addressing the society in our homes. We give our boys guns and dolls to our girls. How do we expect that to change? What about training mothers and fathers? I'd imagine both have to be involved. Parents need to be educated and made aware of the wrong gender perceptions that they pass on. Culturally in India, men's attitudes to date are the outcome of the way the boy child is raised by the woman and the man, and all is accepted from the men and women, and girls have to just accept that. So, do we need intervention at home? We've talked a lot about children. What about at home?
Did you just ask, do we need intervention at home? Yeah.
I want to ask
Of
you, what do you
course.
think? Let's ask
What
him.
do you think, James? Yeah.
Which allows me to come to a, can I conclude with my thoughts?
Yes,
Great, okay. So it was interesting listening to Dr. Gupta talk about North and South. I'm a South Indian, married to a North Indian, and it is the strangest combination to be in, especially on this issue. Well, thank you, and I did not see that movie, no. I was brought up in a very, I guess like most good Keralite families, the whole household was run by my grandmother. And when I say run by my grandmother, I mean run by my grandmother. Everybody, fell in line. We grew up in a rural area of Kerala. We grew up and my father emigrated. And my father created a household that was run by the man. Very interesting, isn't it? Which is, in reflection, was kind of odd. When I look at the kind of families that my sister and I have created, I don't know. I mean, I think it's useful to ask my kids and my niece about this. But we're certainly, in a completely different economic stratosphere than my grandmother was growing, in trying to create this. And so we have so many more options. And frankly, our options allow us for role differentiation. And those role differentiations are very traditional. Is that right or wrong? I don't know. I have a daughter, and we live in a community of 350 families in which 10 of the families have working women. 10 of the families have working women. So, yeah, I mean, everybody else is quite happy. I don't know if happy, but I mean, at least that's what I see. So I don't know what are my kids taking back and what kind of families they will create, given this is the environment they grow in. I grew up with a very strong grandmother, and so I know the role that, that she played, not just in my personal life, but even in the family and in the economic development of our family and everything. My kids don't have that. So do we need intervention at home? Yes, but I don't have a clue what that intervention is. Good place to end. Thank you.
Excellent. Great. Excellent. Well, if anybody has any ideas for James, let him know afterwards. What kind of intervention you need. We have had an extraordinary day. Thank you to our panel. You have shown incredible depth of knowledge and insight and commitment yourselves. It's been inspiring and enlightening. I think I can speak for everyone here. We are deeply grateful for all that you are doing and all that you're inspiring many of us to do. Just a couple of notes before we wrap up today. I will not try and recap the day as I once thought I might. I think that might put you all to sleep. But I do want to share with you a couple of things that are coming up. One tonight, and again, I gave it a little plug earlier, but we have an incredible treat ahead of us tonight. I hope you will all be joining us at the Fickey Auditorium. We're asking for all of you to be seated there by 6 o'clock. Buses will be leaving from the front of just outside actually, the tea room by 5:15. Is that right, Darcy? 5:15. And they'll loop, so you'll have transportation there as well as transportation back. It's very hard to park there, so it may be an option even if you happen to have your car here tonight. This is going to be the culmination of 5 days' work from between 40 young, remarkable young women who have overcome a myriad of hardships but are learning to use dance as a means of expression and a means of finding joy and hope. They have created their very own personal choreography, which will represent them and who they are. It is going to be special. So we'll see that. We'll also get to have a moment with the professional dancers of the Battery Dance Company from New York. They are extraordinary dancers. I'm a little biased. I'm on the board of that organization, but you'll be excited to see them. We also have the extraordinary Malika Sarabhai, who is our guest dancer this evening, and she is going to be performing her work, I Am Not That Woman, which is incredibly powerful. If you haven't seen it, please be with us tonight. A final note of housekeeping, and then we'll let you go. Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., we have an incredible treat. We have the India premiere of Daughters of Mother India. It is a remarkable documentary by filmmaker Vibha Bakshi, who is with us at the back of the auditorium. This is a film that is being shown in film festivals around the world coming up. But we will be the first ones to see it here in India. It'll be the first time it's shown. It is a remarkable work that features experts such as Dr. Gupta and others, and following the gang rape of a young child last year in Delhi, Vibha was remarkably able to get embedded with the Delhi police. And so this is footage that you will never seen before, insights that will bring it all to an incredible perspective as we launch into our law panel. So it is an absolutely great tee-up for the discussions that will follow. And I'm just going to ask the gentleman to cue a 1 minute trailer, minute and a half trailer that will give you a sense of what we're going to get to see tomorrow. It'll be followed by a conversation with the filmmaker herself. So please don't miss it tomorrow. We'll see you outside for tea as we wrap up and get ready to go this evening. Do you want to just sit so you can you see? Can you see from where you are? Oh, please, please.
How can an ordinary bus ride home go so horribly wrong?
It's quite clear that when 4 or 5 people settle on one woman and rape her, then they don't see the woman as a person.
Sexual violence is real. Bachi ka ghar kahan hai? And it does not only happen in the streets, it can happen at home, it can happen just anywhere.
72 hours after that brutal rape of a student in Delhi.
It was a case which could have happened to any normal Delhi girl. Enough is enough. We can't take this victimization anymore.
When you talk about rape, in Hindi they say, Izzat lut gayi. Izzat is like, you've lost your honor.
She's first raped, then she has to tell the whole story before the policeman, then she has to tell the whole story before the judge. She's raped over and over again in a way.
Crime against women has traditionally received low priority amongst the police and unfortunately in the judiciary as well.
I am searching for answers to so many questions.
जो इतने छोटे छोटे बच्चों के साथ इस तरह की जो घटनाएं हो रही हैं, वो ये हमारी पाशविकता को ही दिखा रहा है कि हम समाज में मानव कहलाने के लायक नहीं।
At the same Delhi, same people, but now the cases are more. What does it mean?
प्रॉब्लम बड़ी है। 4005 साल से जो सोसाइटी बनी हुई वो एक दिन में नहीं बदलने जा रही।
कोई भी बदलाव एक दिन में नहीं आता। It takes time to change.
1947 में जो फ्रीडम मिली थी, सिर्फ मर्दों को नहीं मिली थी, वो औरतों को मिली।
What happened to our fight for justice? Did anything change after all those protests in our country?
As you can see, it's going to be remarkable. So we'll see you here tomorrow at 9 a.m. We'll see you at the FICCI Auditorium in just an hour. All right, enjoy your tea. Thanks for a great day, everyone. We appreciate it.